All right, everyone, let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum. Oh, yeah, hi, good afternoon. I heard somebody call in response. Thank you. Glad that you're all here in the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences this Wednesday for our Lunchtime Discovery series. Every Wednesday at noon, we're here inside this space, meeting interesting people, doing interesting, passionate work across all kinds of topics in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, medicine, education. They come in here into the space, and we get to learn from them, and then we get to ask them questions too, and they get to learn from us. So this series is wonderful. It is a partnership too. Us here at the museum, we have the space, we can host it, and the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education works very diligently and hard to find these interesting people and set the series up for success and bring them here into the museum. Between us and the Department of Environmental Quality and the Office of Environmental Education, I think we've got a pretty good thing going here in the Daily Planet Theater with the Lunchtime Discovery series. For the month of February, it's been very exciting too because the Environmental Education Office put together an amazing history to celebrate Black History Month. And so we've had incredible presentations all month long. You can go back and watch past presentations from this series on the museum's live stream account. If you want more information, know where to find that. Just see me after the show. We'll get you connected with all of that information so that you can go back, watch, learn, and stay interested. To kick off today's presentation, I want to introduce you to someone very special, Andrea Knight. Andrea is the chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee within the Department of Environmental Quality. Please put your hands together and welcome Andrea to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out to our fourth lecture series that we've put together for Black History Month. We're really glad that you came out this afternoon. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Melody Hunter-Pillion, who is a broadcast journalist and a public history doctoral student at North Carolina State University. A major area of Melody's research deals with the critical questions of how African American farmers are dealing with such issues as heritage depletion, land loss, and climate change. She will be sharing with us portions of the oral histories which help to define and inform these issues. Let's extend a warm welcome to Melody as she comes to the stage.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you guys for being here. I have to tell you, I am so thrilled to see the Simmons family, these rare African-American farmers in Eastern North Carolina, just to see their images so big here. And one of the reasons I decided to do a project on African-American farmers was the fact that coming from a rural county myself, I grew up in Laurinburg in Scotland County, and as I thought about doing this project, I did not realize one of the biggest challenges would be identifying people who still practice this particular heritage industry in the African American community. And it was only then that I realized that those images, those traditional images of culture in rural counties that I had seen growing up, of farmers on their African American farmers, Lumbee Indian farmers who lived in the county that I live in, as well as white farmers who would be driving their tractors down the road to get from one field to the other. I can remember, and maybe some of you do too, and raise your hand if you do, that the farmers would come through our neighborhoods in the morning. So they'd go out early at 5:30 in the morning, that's right, and pick those crops, and they would come through the neighborhoods around 7:30 a.m., and Mama and Granny would send us out there and say, go get us 2 bushels of corn, or go get us 2 bushels of butter beans. And if some of you remember, after you got all those butter beans, you would sit on the porch with your sisters or neighbors, and you might spend 5 or 6 hours. You're nodding your head. You would spend 5 or 6 hours shelling those butter beans until your thumbs were sore, but you would have great stories to tell. And so today what I say is a segue into this video is that this is about storytelling. It is about oral tradition and how it is a part of our heritage. But this is also about how as we lose the land to climate change or other things, that there is a spatial erasure that is connected to a heritage erasure too, and I wanted to identify that. So again, I'm happy to see these faces on the screen because this is really their stories. You're going to hear from the Simmons family. You're going to hear from Louis Dozier, who's a farmer. You're going to hear from Harry Bryant, who's a retired shrimper who had been a farmer as well. So these are all connections. I do want to tell you that originally this was a podcast. It still is a podcast that will be available at the Southern Oral History Program's website in about 2 weeks. I have cut it down from 28 minutes to 17 minutes for you guys and added some visuals to it. So I hope that you will enjoy this. In the meantime, some things that I want you to think about. If you will take a minute, because again, this was meant to be an audible project, I want you at times, because I have added some visuals, to take a moment and close your eyes and just listen to the voices, the dialect, the richness of certain terms that they say, how they turn a phrase, and also the distinctive dialects of Eastern North Carolina, and just see if you notice a difference between listening alone and listening while we view some of the visuals here. And afterwards, we're going to have a Q&A. You can ask me some questions, but I'm also going to ask questions of you guys if you don't mind sharing. So right now, I hope that you will enjoy this video and the storytelling from the folks down in Eastern North Carolina in Brunswick County.
We're talking about climate change.
Yes, sir.
This is my youngest, Brian.
Hey, Boss Melody, nice to meet you. And do you farm too?
So you need to get away from here and go off to school and get a better job, you know.
Never plan on an east wind. Good Lord, yes, sir.
And I've always told the fellas, I said, you guys that are in timber or in construction, you know, if the weather's bad, you just let it hold it until the weather's over. But once you put a seed in the ground, there's no turning back. If the weather is bad, it's a loss. My name is Louis Dozier. We're in Supply, North Carolina. And at the present time, farming is what I've been doing for the last few years. So I grew up behind a mule growing soybeans, peanuts, sweet potatoes, of course, was number 2, and tobacco was number 1 crop. I would farm with my father from birth till about 18 years old. Then I left home, and of course I started, you know, trying to get an education and serving in the military. I've been farming since '75. Farming is more vulnerable and risky in the weather than any other area that I know, and that has affected us.
The sky threatened rain when I arrived in Supply, North Carolina, a rural coastal community in the Brunswick County township of Lockwood Folly. It sits beside a tidal river of the same name. Before meeting Louis Dozier, the farmer whose voice you just heard, I drove down Little Macedonia Road, passing fields and crumbling tobacco curing barns. 2 things struck me that day: how individual stories in small communities can simply slip away with no one the wiser, and the early spring field sat empty and undisturbed.
And I did a little tilling a couple of weeks ago, but for the most part, we're behind as far as tilling for spring planting. In this area, the water table is high, and there's so much moisture in the soil until it's just nowhere for it to go.
Dozier patiently answered my questions about the weather and other challenges facing black farmers in Eastern North Carolina. Is there a timeline for you where it's just too late and you won't be able to plant?
That happened to me last year, me personally, last year, 2018. I wanted to plant some vegetables, but by the time the weather turned warm enough and it dried up enough, it was really too late. I've been farming on my own now since 1975, and quite honestly, 2018 is about the worst year I've seen.
What happened in 2018? Record rains and flooding from Hurricane Florence, and the water table from that and winter rains is still high.
So something's changing. Something's changing. Of course, I had some disasters before, but the most drastic changes I've seen in this area, since I've been farming, I believe was 2018. It was an unusually cool, wet spring, then really hot and dry, then the storms came through. So something's changing. I'm not suggesting that it's changed more than ever, but there's something happening within the last few years that hasn't happened before. We have to deal with, modern equipment, and you just can't get it to go.
Can't do it.
See, now a lot of the fellows that maybe have equipment enough with the 4 wheels can do a little better.
The tractors rolled less than 2 miles down the road at a neighboring farm, the Simmons farm.
Cleveland Simmons, 60. And my occupation has always been farming and trucking. And I farm because I love it. I truck because that's what pays the bills.
Are you from a farming family?
I am. My dad was a farmer. We sharecrop tobacco. And that was the base money crop back then. I've been on the tractor ever since I was 4 years old. I was slaying tobacco at 4. So, here we are.
And there ain't nothing like sitting on that tractor and riding up and down. It's kind of like you and the machine, and it becomes an extension of you.
But farmer Cleveland Simmons, they call him Cleve, and his 3 sons seemed skeptical the equipment could hold its own in the wet conditions.
It's been so wet. I was actually surprised the footage you got of Justin cutting just a minute ago. I was actually surprised the tractor stood up as well as it did because it's actually rained twice this week.
Rare images. You see, black farmers are rare, though farming and fishing were once primary ways of making a living for black folk in the South. That's complicated history, and we'll get back to it. African Americans make up 1.3% of the nation's 3.4 million farmers. In 2012, Brunswick County had 333 farmers in all. 61 of those were black farmers, only 4 under the age of 35. Cleve Simmons' sons represent those few young black farmers.
The way we operate, you pretty much have to be a mechanic, an agronomist, a chemist, and your own general labor. Ever since I was knee-high to nothing, we've been out here plowing this land.
I'm Brian Simmons. I'm 25 years old. For me, growing up as a little boy, Granddaddy used to have hogs too. So he would have us over there every day because they live right across the street. We walk over there and help him feed the hogs every morning. And it's just keeping the tradition alive.
I'm Justin Simmons. I'm 27 years old.
I would say he's the most outspoken and the former state vice president for 4-H in North Carolina. How do these young farmers deal with climate change and Mother Nature in general? They learn from their father, uncles, grandfather, and other farmers who come before them.
Yes, ma'am. The most important one, never plan on the east wind. Good Lord, yes.
Why? Like when you said that, I was like, what does that mean? What's that?
It says so in the Bible. The east wind brings a man no good. If you plan on the east wind, it'll kill everything.
It'll come up, but it will not produce. And that's from way, way, way biblical days.
Right.
Cleve Simmons, he's also a Baptist preacher. Religion weaves its way through their farming and oral traditions.
And to finish the story, planting on the east wind, if you go back to the Bible, winds directly out the east, it's a poison wind. You'll grow a beautiful bush, everything, but your stuff would not be productive because it says, don't plant. And I don't care how pretty the day is, how much is rain, if it's winds directly out the east, we're not putting it in the dirt.
And so y'all have seen that.
Yes, ma'am. Plant on the east wind.
But if nobody told you, you wouldn't know, right?
No, and you would have to go through a process of elimination and all that.
So it's in the Bible, and your dad told you about it, and then you guys heard it from him or your granddad?
Both.
Both.
Because Granddaddy was he planted everything by science. He was a firm believer in the Farmer's Almanac and did not do anything that did not coincide with the Farmer's Almanac and the sign.
The timing, it used to, like now, we've been putting corn in the dirt. We don't do that anymore because if we put it in the dirt now and it freezes between the 1st of April, corn crops don't. Some people do it, but you're not going to get the germination. So now we wait for about the 2nd week of April to start really putting stuff in the dirt heavy. That the old farmers could tell you, you can put it in the dirt with it cold, it's not going to come up. When the ground reaches a certain temperature, it's when your seeds pop out the dirt. And that's from way back. I had an uncle, he said, buddy, you can put it out there, but it's not going to come up. And Uncle Jerry was 93, and he was a nutting on he had a son-in-law, and he was out there planting corn one day. And when you become a young farmer working jobs and you're running big equipment, you just try to get the farm plant. And my uncle said, son, don't put that corn out there today. He said, it's not going to come up. And he turned around and told my uncle, said, I'm planting in the dirt and not the wind. But needless to say, as they say, when it come up, and the old folks say he didn't get enough to say grace over it. So that's stuff that has been, passed down. But I hope and I notice it passed to these guys is a work ethic. Nobody's gonna give you anything at all. So you got to get up and do. And the next thing I'm gonna pass to them that you don't do like the Joneses. We can't afford to do that. We can't afford to run. But if we don't farm a year, the equipment will still be here because it's paid for. Bible says to owe no man.
Like Louis Dozier, the Simmons are pragmatic about debt, land ownership, and the changing environment.
Going to the climate change, I think that's more of, that humans have an impact to it. Do we have an impact? Yes, but we can't stop the rotation. We can't stop the orbit.
And so it's going to happen. So we just have to deal with it.
You have to be able to think on the fly or else you will be in trouble. In this farming thing, there are no guarantees, and your equipment needs to be in good shape. You know about how much money you need to have for the acreage that you're going to have. Those type of things you need to be ahead of, because when you put it in the dirt, it's kind of like, well, it's down now, so all you can do is hope and pray and watch, really.
Closer to the water, not even 100 yards from the Lockwood Folly estuary, retired shrimper Harry Bryant is as practical as the farmers in his community.
Everybody can't swim. Everybody can't swim. It's something you either love it or you hate it. You have to learn how to live with it. When you go out there shrimping, you got to put all your might in the shrimping. You got to have confidence in your boat. You got to have confidence you can shrimp.
The Bryants, Simmons, and Doziers have long family histories in Brunswick County, African American heritage linked to the land and sea.
My ancestors arrived in Brunswick County in 1863 with a slave owner that came from Pitt or Craven County.
With a chief boat builder to assist, Bryant built his own 56-foot shrimp boat back in 1971.
And we worked night and day from then for 6 months building that boat. The Morning Light. That's what we named it, the Morning Light. I had all the confidence that I could make it work. I always knew that at that time there was a lot of shrimp around, but then after I got started, it was a challenge, but I liked it because I could take care of my family. That was my main goal. That was the main goal. I was my own boss. And I could take care of it. We just got just a few acres in the Lockwood Folly estuaries. We can get oysters anymore or clams. Just a few acres. Whenever we used to could start off, I don't know how many 100 acres it was, the whole bay, we could fish the whole bay with clams and oysters. Yes, there is a change. The tide stays higher all the time. that it did whenever did I build this building. It's higher all the time. Whenever we have a storm, we have storms higher. The water table rises higher. We get more rain in the storm. In the creeks down there now, like where we go get oysters at, it don't fall as low. You can just see it visible with your eyes that the average tide is higher than what it used to be. So it's a difference, and it's more severe. Normal rain in this area is 54 inches. The record we know of was up until this year was 84. That was just 1 year, the record. This year it was over 100 inches. I don't argue with people about what caused it. I don't know. Now you can make up your mind happening on its own. Because I would have no basis to argue as
It's a very, very, very serious situation. When I have to stop,
Rent as much land as they can afford. It's going to be difficult getting young African American.
difficult for two reasons, in my opinion. They don't see being able to make a living, that is financially, and of course, the younger people live. You're crazy, and what's a farmer?
History created a reputation. These farmers say
Ain't gonna get nothing out of farming. Farming's hard work. It's this, it's that.
Somebody got to do it or you don't eat.
Exactly. And of course you want to weed the negative out as much as you can, but passing along good oral traditions is something that's key and essential to building and keeping a good community.
As much as it's possible, we are masters of our own domain. That's the thing that I love.
A special thanks now to the farmers and fishermen who shared their stories with me. Harry Bryant, Louis Dozier, Cleveland, Troy, Justin, and Brian Simmons. A thank you to Dr. Blair Kelly, history professor and assistant dean in NC State University's College of Humanities and Social Sciences, who introduced me to and instructed me in the important work of oral history. Also, thank you to Dr. Melinda Lowry, director of the Center for the Study of the American South at UNC Chapel Hill, who guided this project from inception to finish. And Sarah Wood, project manager for the Southern Oral History Program. The program's archival oral testimonies provided historical context to this project. This is Melody Hunter-Pillion, public historian at North Carolina State University. Thank you for listening. Thank you guys, and I hope you enjoyed listening to the Simmons family, to Harry Bryant, to Louis Dozier. Oral histories are very important because they become part of the historical record. Without capturing these voices and these stories, oral histories, we call them perishable because those stories pass away along with the people who tell them. So if there's not someone to put them in the archive, we simply don't have that as a part of the historical record. And now their stories will be part of the historical record at UNC, at the Wilson Library as part of the Southern Oral History program. And this podcast, the fuller podcast that will include some older interviews as well to give it more nuance and context, will be a part of that podcast that you can listen to at sohp.org. So now what I want to do is to take some questions from you, but also to ask you guys some questions. Can I start with the questions from you first? Can I ask you some questions? All right, so I'm going to do this. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you were watching the exchange between the Simmons family, and they were talking about their grandfather and how he farmed. Would you mind talking about how that resonated with you, because you said something to me? Are you okay with that? Okay, he's going to bring you a microphone, Chris is, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Well, my name is Tyrone Hightower, and my hometown is Norlina, which is in Warren County. My grandfather and my grandmother, they owned a farm They raised pigs, they raised chickens. I hated the farm when I was younger because they made us go out in the fields to pick tobacco and string beans and corn and anything you can think of. But I miss those days now because we don't have that type of food now. But back to her, the main reason for me having a microphone is my grandfather, he wouldn't plant anything, he wouldn't even kill pigs if the moon wasn't right. Hello? Hello? If the moon wasn't right.
I think that one's going out, but here, I'm going to share with you. You said he wouldn't do anything, and say that again if you would.
He wouldn't do, oh, there we go. He wouldn't plan anything if the east wind was going or if the moon wasn't in a certain phase or anything like that. He wouldn't kill pigs or anything like that. He said the blood wouldn't come out and it would spoil the meat and stuff. So, and the thing about it is that he couldn't read or write. All he could do was sign an X though, but we always had food. We always had, you know, good livestock and everything like that though. And I think that's something that's missing from today's society is that people don't want to work hard and they don't want to, I guess, they want more technological things. They're not willing to raise this food and take the patience and stuff like that to get the, I guess, the nutritional values and stuff like that because everything's now is processed. And I think that's part of what's playing into our poor health these days too. I'm sorry, I just ran away on a tangent.
No, you're fine. I'm so glad you said those things. You mentioned also, and I think Chris will grab that, is that you mentioned your grandfather not being able to read and write. And so we do know that strong oral traditions come out of communities where, for whatever reason, literacy might have been curtailed in some way, and we know the history of that. So it is not surprising that these oral traditions help people to do things as far as work, to provide, to make sure that they had sustenance, and to be able to cultivate the land and make the land something productive that they could do. And passing down those oral traditions then becomes a necessity, and that's what your family was doing in Warren County. So someone else talked about shelling those butter beans until your fingers get sore. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, sure. I'm Nicole, and I'm actually from Virginia.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know if I would say that my grandparents had a farm. I don't know if they would label it as a farm, but they did. They had everything, chickens, they had hogs, they had horses, and we did tomatoes. Our biggest thing that we had to harvest as children were sweet potatoes. And that was very difficult. And we had to shuck the peas and get the watermelons and the tomatoes and absolutely everything that you can think of. And I loved it then, even though it was hard work because my grandparents paid us. And I miss it desperately now because it was something that was just absolutely beautiful and fresh, and you could kind of see the hard work and the work ethic. And without having to work that, then that plays such a huge part in work ethic. And so, yeah, I can agree with you. I would remember riding on the back of my grandfather's tractor, going for him to, you know, feed the hogs very early in the morning.
Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
One of the things I remember about shelling the butter beans is we would sit on the porch. The porch is such a southern icon when we think about it, and being outdoors. I grew up in a house with no AC. I didn't live in a place with AC until I went off to college, and that was just normal. We'd leave the screen door open all day during the summer, and all the windows were open. And again, that was just the normal thing to do. And my sisters and I, though, would have these great conversations for hours at a time on the porch together. The neighbors would pass by. They'd come and talk to us, too. So as part of that community dialogue. One of the things I want to ask you guys, though, is which stories resonated most with you? Which narrators were you listening to? You thought, oh, I know that voice, or you found their dialect interesting. Who resonated with you as you watched and listened to this story? Raise your hand if you don't mind sharing. Yes.
Well, I was real interested by Mr. Bryant because he, unlike the inland farmers, he had that high titer.
He does. That's right.
And it, you know, they must not be too far apart, but it's a world of difference in how they're speaking there.
Yeah. No, I noticed that too. And in fact, if you're listening to Harry Bryant, at first you have to almost get used to his dialect to be able to understand it. And he does have the high tighter accent that you would hear like in the Outer Banks. It also reminds me a little bit of the Lumbee dialect if you go into Robinson and Scotland and Hope County. I don't know if you caught that too. There's something about it that reminds me of the Lumbee, the Native American or indigenous tribe accents or dialects that I've heard there. Who else? So Harry Bryant resonated with you. What about anybody else? Was it Harry Bryant or somebody else? You can raise your hand and we'll bring the mic.
Simmons family I'm sorry. It was the Simmons family for me when they're talking about just them generational, and they're talking about their grandfather and some of them from their great-grandfather. That's what resonated with me in some of the stories that they were telling, because you would, and I have.
Do you want to use this one? Are you sure? I'll just give this one to you, sorry.
I grew up with 4 brothers, and we always would talk about what our grandparents would say to us, and just hearing them talk about just the generations of conversations and just some of those phrases that our grandparents would say, and how we would laugh about them. And that's what resonated with me, how they would say, well, my grandfather would say this, and then my mother or my father would say this, and then we would laugh about that. So for me, that brought me back to growing up with my grandparents and the sayings they would say.
I'm glad that you had this memory of African-American farmers that was in your family. At the height of African-Americans being farmers, again, a heritage industry, 1 in every 7 farmers in America was African-American. And now if you saw the percentage there, it's 1.3%, which would be about, 1 in every 100. And so it's such a precipitous decline in those numbers. And that's why capturing these histories is really important, because it is part of a culture and a heritage, not only for the African-American community, but connected to the larger national history that we have and share. And so it's really connecting these things. Any other folks want to talk about the differences in the narratives that struck you, or how? Did anybody actually close their eyes and just listen? Just listen? You did. Can you tell me what was the difference for you when you just listened? And
so they feel, you get to inflect how they feel. And it's almost for a short period of time, you kind of place yourself back in whatever historical perspective that they have. So there was definitely benefit. A couple of times throughout the presentation, in the beginning, in the intro, in the middle, and towards the end, I closed my eyes. I did like he did as well when the gentleman who sounded like he was from the Outer Banks, that resonated. I'm personally from down east, so I was very familiar, like you, with the down east. It's not a dialect, I would say it's an accent. So it felt homely. And if you're from down east, that we say you never meet a stranger, and we wave at everyone down the road, so you think of so many things. And we're, like you said, we're always on the porch because that was our playtime, to just tell long stories. So yeah, it was reflective too for me from that perspective. The one thing that I really wish that they, maybe they are doing that, is the gentleman mentioned that there was very little interest with respect to the younger generation having an interest in farming. Perhaps if they could be the light that continues it, that would be great, to let them know we have technology now. You don't have to do things. I think people are probably imagining physical, tiring, exhaustive labor. And with technology, it certainly, I don't believe, is the case any longer. So just as an encouragement to them, kudos for them for hanging in there. But if they want to pass the legacy, that's a suggestion. Although you probably weren't asking for suggestions.
No, we are asking for, and
Okay.
I know they would love that. In fact, I'm doing follow-up interviews with them and also some farmers in Raven County outside of New Bern, but I think those are great suggestions. And one of the things that the younger Simmons guys are telling their dad is, you know, they're talking about other kinds of crops, hemp, and things like that, something that might be more profitable. So again, it moves things away from what we have traditionally known as North Carolina crops.
Right.
So when y'all think of North Carolina crops, what do you think of? Tobacco. Anything
Tobacco,
else?
sweet potato.
Yep. Cotton, that kind of thing. But North Carolina is moving away from those, at least small farmers. It's very difficult for small farmers now to be able to find that to be a sustainable way of making a living, is being able to farm tobacco or cotton in these days. Who's a farmer in here? Any farmers? Okay, no farmers whatsoever. So, yeah, we have a, yes.
So I was going to respond to something Nicole said too, but then you asked a different question, so I can respond to that one instead. The laughter of the guys, the Simmons family, resonated. It just took me home. I grew up in, not in the eastern part of the state, but in Alexander County, which is like in the foothills. But just the dynamics of family that you have when you're doing things like that together, really, you can't get that in any way besides time with each other. Another thing that gets lost when you don't have that time with different generations is information from those stories. So my grandmother would talk about chinkapins and how she would get these huge ones off of a tree down by such and such field. And now, well, I know there was a blight in that whole thing with chestnuts. It took me years to figure out what a chinkapin was.
Tell us what it is.
It's a chestnut. Okay. So chestnut trees. So she would get, they would be huge, like softball size. Now when I see chestnuts, even on an older tree, which I come upon one, they are very small. So she, in her lifetime, just being able to have that visual of what was changing with this particular plant. And the same thing with my mom. She said they used to run through the field and look for maypops. And when they would, dry up, and they would get them. And so for years again, I'm like, what's a maypop? Nobody could tell me what a maypop was. And it's passion fruit. So my mom grew up eating passion fruit out of the cow pasture all the time. And so it just makes it, I always thought that was a tropical fruit that would even grow here. But now you don't see them just growing in pasture. So it also gives me a baseline for when I'm trying to determine the information I hear about changes as to whether I believe it or not, or to what degree I believe it, because I had their stories about what they saw and experienced in the environment too.
No, that's perfectly said, because part of what oral histories can do when it comes to climate change, whether you believe in climate change or not, is to have these observations of other people over time so that we know from their lived experience the things that they were observing, the visuals that they had, that you saw in your own generation too, and how quickly these changes are happening before us. So that's part of the, it's part of the archival record, but it can become part of the scientific record too. People who know their space and the place that they're in and know it more intimately than anybody else can talk about that change better than anyone else, better than a scientist who might be coming from somewhere else. I attended a conference in New Orleans back in the fall, the Southeast Climate Adaptation Climate Center, they had many scientists, but what they wanted were more humanities people to come and talk about the lived experience and what are people really going through, and how do we connect with people in these communities to find more information, but also to be able to craft solutions of resilience, or at least how we can adapt. If we can't stop whatever's going on with the change, what ways are people already sort of taking on themselves to adapt to the change, and how can other communities learn from that? So there's a lot going on in the scientific community, but what's happening in the humanities is that talking to real folk who see it and know it in their space more than anybody else. You were going to add something, I think.
I just wanted to ask, is there an apprenticeship or some type of internship that they can pass their legacy to, or that's not only in the family but also of interest, for young people that may want to continue this type of lifestyle living?
I don't know, but that's something I wouldn't mind looking into. I know that NC State has a program called the Global Change Fellows. I don't know if that was something that would involve farmers or not. I do know that the Simmons family, in particular Justin, who was a vice president with State 4-H, that the universities, including NC State, North Carolina A&T universities, I think there's a university in Virginia too, often call on this family and they have them come and speak, teaching some classes for them at times too, because of their very practical experience that these gentlemen have. So, but I don't know what kind of program might be in place as far as internships or something that incorporates this change, adaptation, resiliency with what they're doing and the pragmatic part of farming too. So that's a good question though. Yes, Bridget.
There's over at NCA&T in Greensboro, there's a Dr. Crystal Kyle, she graduated from Virginia Tech, just got her PhD, and she's starting a program to try to encourage young veterans to go into farming. So she's working out of NCA&T, and so that might be some place to look into.
That is excellent. Bridget actually is a veteran too. We went to school together at Duke to get our master's degree, so thank you. And it's great to know that there's a program like that. Any other questions or comments? I don't know how much time we have, and I don't know if we need to wrap it up. Okay, very good. Another question or a comment? Yes. Yeah. Oh, here's a mic, Cheryl, I think.
I think something that struck me was you had mentioned that the religion weaves its way through their farming and everything.
Yeah, and they talked about that in their storytelling, right?
Yes, and I think that so much of this, that resonated with me because my grandparents were, I wouldn't say farmers, but they had all of that as well, chickens and hogs and everything. But just to hear them speak, they're pragmatist, they're practical, and just to hear them, just to hear their stories. I mean, the greater scale is what they're doing and what you're doing with their story, but just for me to sit here and hear this story, it just all resonated with me. And then to hear the stories around that result from this. So I think it's really important work.
Thank you. Thank you, Cheryl, for that observation. And yes, go ahead.
I think now, while we don't have as many young people in this professions, that times have changed and people are more concentrating on getting the job that will give them the most money, and that's just not farming right now. Back in the day, you didn't have to pay for labor because you birthed your labor. My parents each had 12 siblings each, and their grandparents or their parents, they own farms though, so you don't have to worry about paying people to do that because you can't really practically have 12 children in this day and time though. So I think it's just not on the forefront of anybody's mind to go into a profession that you would just be maybe feeding yourself, or you just have to struggle in order to try to survive.
Yes. So if you go into farming, it's very intentional. Like with the Simmons, to keep it up is a very intentional thing, and they've got reasons behind it.
Yeah, I think things like this, like oral histories and like documentaries like this, are really going to bring the idea of farming back into the forefront of like people's attention. I think it has less to do a little bit with like people just not being interested in it or looking for money, even though that is an aspect. I think a lot of it has to do with people are just disconnected from food and like food systems, and like getting back into like the natural world and the green world and being connected to the environment, and like growing your food is kind of foreign to people. But I think it's important, especially for young African American people to see things like this, because it's so vital to a huge part of our history that oftentimes is we have like a lot of negativity around it because of the cultural context of like farming and being African American in America. So I think this is important. I really enjoyed it.
So thank you, and I'm glad you brought that up. So in the podcast, the full podcast, if you listen to it, we bring in some other voices that talk about the degradation of the institution of slavery and enslaved people having to work the land, make the land productive and cultivate, and then what sort of connotations in the Simmons family and also Louis Dozier, they start talking about that a little bit, about how there's almost this negative thing with young African Americans because it harkens back to a particular time when working the land was associated with something that connected them to degradation. But what they're saying is, we are, in saying we're masters of our own domain or destiny, that we cultivate, we produce the land, we can make something with the land when we work at it, that this is a talent that we have to be able to do, and something that is a contribution to the community and to society.
Right. It's really like shifting the narrative on that, because I think the narrative has been around for a really long time. You mentioned your grandfather and you mentioned your grandfather. My grandfather, he was like one of the people that like worked for somebody else's land, and he ended up leaving and joining the military because he didn't want to be working
sharecropping.
A sharecropper. That's what it was. So
Yeah.
he came from that history, and he ended up like getting out and going to the military, going off to the Vietnam War, and making a way like for our family in a different way. But that was kind of like the history behind that. Like he didn't want to work the land because of like how that was. So I think it's a narrative that's been around for generations, and it's like finally starting to shift, but like the numbers have become so stagnant. Because one of the things that I really thought was interesting was the statistic of like 1.3% of like the 3.4 million like farmers. Like that is so crazy. That's like so small. We need
Especially when so many African Americans farmed and were very good at it, like very knowledgeable. But I think what you were also saying about this narrative that's been passed on and sharecropping, and again, there's more discussion of that in the podcast, and it pulls in some older oral histories from the Southern Oral History Program to help people understand that. And those voices are coming from Richmond County and some other areas and explaining what sharecropping really is. And it was just a losing sort of situation to be in. And that sharecropping is really connected in many ways to the migration that you see of African Americans from the South to the North and to the Midwest to some bigger urban areas. And so when you connect that migration, and if you look back now, there's sort of this migration back to the South. And what are people doing in those instances of migration? How does that look when we connect it back to the land? How does it look when we connect it back to development and also to what may be happening with the climate? And if you listen to the way the farmers and the retired shrimpers talk about climate change, one of the things they say for sure is, hey, I'm not trying to be a scientist. I'm not going to say to you it's climate change, but I'm telling you what I see with my own two eyes. That actually is more believable and credible, I think many audiences find, and the general public finds that message of climate change more credible because it's from a person who is not pushing an agenda. They're just saying, here's what I see, and I know it because I've been here long enough and I know this land. So I think it makes a difference. Any other, yes?
So I wanted to know, does the podcast go into depth? Did any of the families, the Simmons family or the Dozier family, speak about the financial challenges and kind of obtaining capital and having, because as it pertains to, particularly in North Carolina, the issues that farmers, and particularly black farmers, have had to deal with, dealing with the USDA and things of that nature. Have they talked about that and the challenges with that issue?
They do talk about that, and I have some of my own track in there that talks about the USDA and the history and even the admissions of the USDA of the discrimination against
black farmers over many, many decades and how that went. And obviously there have been some big major lawsuits that African American farmers have won in suing the USDA for that. So they do go into that and they talk about that, but they also talk about this current struggle for just, developers who have the money to purchase land, and sometimes in a system that's set up where maybe it's easier for them to come in and swipe some land away that farmers might want to. And so in supply, there's a concerted effort in that community to keep the land for farmers, and not just for African American farmers. So even though in this story for a dissertation, I have to be very focused on what I'm looking at, or it could take like 25 years to finish a dissertation if you don't focus, I'm looking at African Americans. But there are many stories from this and many angles of this that apply to all farmers in North Carolina, or even all farmers across the nation, and some of the, especially small farmers, and some of the things that they are facing today. So this microcosm that I'm looking at, you can really apply across the board to many different types of communities, and I hope that's what people can take away from this. Anything else? All right, that's it. Thank y'all so much for listening today, and I hope you remember these voices.
Thank you very much, Melody.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for coming out to today's Lunchtime Discovery presentation. I hope you found it enjoyable, insightful. Thank you for sharing your stories and for collecting these stories too. And we'll be back here next Wednesday with another program. So I hope you'll check us out. If you want more information about the live broadcast or how you can watch future or past recordings, just find me, Lisa, or Marty there at the back. We'd be happy to set you up. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.